quantum computing, and cryptography. Anyway, among other things. She's going to work with the intersection of technology and government, which is something that is always of interest to her. So if she's moving on to those pastures, in the interim, I will be taking over and filling my old shoes, I suppose, here at the Development Forum. But that said, we also had some other changes here at the city recently, beginning of this month, a couple days ago. The rotation of the mayor occurred. So Mayor Silva is now Council Member Silva, and Mayor Pro Tem Luella Haskew is now ascended to mayor. So Mayor Haskew will be the mayor for 2020. And the new Mayor Pro Tem, Vice Mayor, if you will, is Kevin Wilk. So that's at the top of the food chart, or food chain, top of the org chart, Mayor Haskew and Mayor Pro Tem Wilk. We haven't been the only ones busy changing places, doing new things, et cetera. Sacramento's been busy, you may have heard. I read a headline, I think it was, or an article that said the governor signed, I think, 860 or 868 bills over this last legislative session, which is no small feat. I can't imagine signing my name that many times, but anyway. So they have been active, and the result of that has been a number of housing bills, among other bills, and I believe Kimberly may touch on some legislation that affects her work. But we will have some changes to make in our ordinances and processes. And I'll say one of the more urgent, literally urgency ordinance that will be presented next Tuesday to our city council relates to accessory dwelling units. And so if you have an interest in that realm, we will be updating through an urgency ordinance to preserve some of our local conditions in our existing ordinance so that we remain consistent with state law. We will then further refine not only our ADU ordinance, but other ordinances to be consistent with state law as required. So just more to come on that front, but we are not ignoring it, but those are things that we will be looking forward to in 2020, some further changes. One of the other things I want to highlight for those who, and many of the staff know about this already, for those of you who may not, who are in the room, back in, I think it was November of 2016, we adopted or City Council accepted staff's attempt to refine the delivery of development services, and that was called the Blueprint for Success. Well received, over 60 initiatives, 80% of which, 4 out of 5, were either completed or remain underway because they're ongoing process improvements. So we're proud of that fact. We were so proud, in fact, the council said, you did such a great job, do it again. So we decided to do it again, and we were told to, and we have. And we had City Council receive Blueprint V2. We continue to work on that. And heading into 2020, for the next 18 months, we'll be working on initiatives in our version 2, and there are 3 pots that we're focusing on: development, design review, permitting, and the third category is customer service. So the experience that customers have coming to City Hall, interacting with staff, interacting physically at the counter, and improvements and changes we can make there. But we continue to work on that. Jessica Cole also led that initiative in terms of the implementation of our blueprint. I'm happy to say we have a very capable woman named Janine Cavalli, senior planner, who will be filling in that role. Janine has tackled a number of special projects for the city and project managed very well. She'll be taking on the blueprint. So if you have any questions relative to the blueprint, you can talk to me, or you can talk to Janine Cavalli as well. Lastly, as a wrap up quickly, we are at the end of the year, as I mentioned. We're going to do a year-end survey. Look for a link as a follow-up to this, this meeting. It'll have a link to the YouTube link. We record all of these sessions, and this is no exception today. And so look for that link. If you missed something, or those of you who weren't able to make it can revisit and see Kimberly's riveting presentation, or mine. And then we'll also have a link to a survey for year-end to see where interests lie ahead. We're looking at our next meeting being, as noted, in February of 2020, because at the end of the year, City Hall goes dark for about 10 days, starting Christmas Eve through the holiday season, through the first of the year. We open back up on Thursday. I believe it's a Thursday, January 2nd. So for those of you interested in work here, those are some dates to be aware of. When we all get back in the room in January, we'll look ahead to February to do another forum. So if you're planning ahead, February will be the next one. I think I've touched on all the pieces I had to touch on, but I'll ask if there are any questions or clarifications. If not, that's great. I will make one last note, is at the back table, the half circle table, there's a sign-in sheet if you haven't signed in. There's also both a summary of our past success with Blueprint V1, as well as a copy of Blueprint V2. You can get a sample of what we've done and what we are planning to do. So I'm going to stop there, and as I said, if there are any questions, happy to answer. Otherwise, I'm going to turn it over and welcome Kim Lamb. She's the municipal manager from Human Public Services. Appreciate you being here, and I will pull up your presentation, hand you a microphone, and set you off.
All right, good morning, everyone. Is this on?
It is.
Okay, perfect. So as Ethan mentioned, I'm really excited to trash talk with you all here today. I've never used that phrase before. Just kidding, I have many times. So I'm with Public Services. We're the franchise garbage, recycling, and organics hauler for Walnut Creek, as well as many other cities nearby. You probably recognize us by our blue trucks here, driving on the streets. So I wanted to go over a couple items that are important, I think, for the development services team to be aware of, because oftentimes with new projects or renovations, we are usually the last thought for a developer. They built a beautiful building, and then they're like, oh wait, where should we put those trash cans again? Let's carve out a little space, and so we run into some issues there.
Sorry, I was going to say to advance this, it's just want to push left or right.
So first wanted to talk about enclosures. That's what we call the rooms or the spaces where all the dumpsters and carts go. So you may recognize some photos in this presentation. A lot of them are from Walnut Creek. So oftentimes the biggest issue is that there's not enough space. As you can see from the left photo, it's this little closet. We've barely been able to fit 2 1-yards. So the front one is the trash, the one in the back is recycling. The issue with really narrow spaces like this is that the recycle driver, in order to get to his bin, has to pull out the garbage dumpster first. There has to be enough space outside wherever this enclosure is to put the garbage dumpster while he then goes in to get the recycle dumpster, pulls that out, services it, and then one by one pushes them back in. And the whole time this is happening, the truck is idling, whether it's on the street or in the parking lot, while he's making this transition. So this makes it really difficult for our drivers as we are then blocking space in the parking lot while he's doing this. The other issue with a setup like this is that for tenants who are using these containers, it's really hard for them to get back to the recycle dumpster. And so if you are short on time or just in a rush, you might just throw everything you have into the first dumpster available, which might not be the right one. The other issue is, even if there is space, there's usually a lot of other stuff that is stashed by the dumpsters. As you can see in the photo here, we've got other containers, maybe an old refrigerator or something in the back. And so then when our drivers pull the dumpsters out, there's always a risk that we might damage something. And if it's ever an issue where he thinks that he might not be able to safely pull out the bins, then we might not even be able to service the containers. And we would have to call that into dispatch, mark it as not accessible, and in the meantime, the containers are then continuing to fill up with material. So it becomes an issue that builds on itself. Some other issues here. This enclosure, we deal with a lot of pavement issues as well, and because our drivers do have to pull out those bins, it damages the wheels pretty often, or we just have a hard time getting the bins out easily. This is a restaurant in downtown Walnut Creek. Very weird shaped enclosure. It's a triangle. And originally they just had a garbage dumpster, then recycling became mandatory. So they tried to shove a couple of recycle carts in there. Now organics or composting is mandatory. And so there's not really much space left to squeeze in a green cart. The other issue with trying to squeeze in carts, although they are nice because they have a smaller footprint than dumpsters, it's really hard to put in large pieces of cardboard, and that's the biggest volume of recycling that comes from a business is usually cardboard boxes from shipping and food deliveries. And so then the business ends up having to take a lot of time trying to cut those pieces of cardboard small enough to squeeze into a cart. And usually those carts fill up with just a couple boxes, as you can see. So this is just an example of a very common issue we deal with, especially with restaurants, is just the space and trying to squeeze in all the mandatory containers that are needed. Here's an enclosure where we sort of managed to fit in the mandatory organics, but if you can imagine, there's 2 green carts here, and it's really hard to get to the one in the back. If you've got a bag of food from the back of the kitchen, there's no way you're tossing that over into the back cart. So really, usually what happens here is the front one gets overflowing, and then the back one's empty and not accessible. Then it's also hard to get to the back ends of the recycle dumpster or the garbage dumpster as well. So then everything is kind of front-loaded, and that causes issues as well. This enclosure also definitely not big enough. And just more examples where, again, people think carts are flexible, but it just causes a lot of issues here. Hard to fit in cardboard. And then our drivers also have to deal with cooking oil and other stuff that restaurants don't always do the right thing with or know what to do with. And in this case, our driver would not be able to get to any of the back carts, and so things would continue to pile up. And I could keep going on and on. Basically, the main point is space is a really, really big issue for us. A lot of the property owners just say, well, why don't you just come more often to service your containers? But there is a limit because we don't operate on we don't operate routes on Sundays. On Saturdays, we have limited routes, and then Monday through Friday, we are in most places, but depending on routing, we don't have time to get to every part of town Monday through Friday. Downtown, we are in the main corridors every day, but again, a lot of times that's not enough. And once things pile up, then we can't get to the main container, and again, it just keeps going on and on. The other issue is with the number of carts. As I mentioned, every time our driver services one cart, he has to go and pull that to the truck, dump it, move that back to the original spot, get the next cart, and so on. So this restaurant here, there were even more green carts. I just cut that out. But our truck will be sitting there for probably 10 minutes while they're slowly getting cart by cart. And another example. Another thing that we've seen is a lot of the enclosures are now far deep into a building where our truck can't even access. So, for example, the enclosure room for this spot is inside the parking garage, which our driver can't get to because our truck can't fit under there. So then they have to pull the bins out, but they didn't plan a spot to place the bins, so now these are kind of, one is in a parking spot, there's 2 right by the crosswalk and almost into the street. So this is another issue as well because I believe they have 3 days a week at least service. So 3 days of the week, these bins are just sitting out there waiting for us to service them. Another thing I wanted to touch on is contamination. You may have been reading or hearing that China and other countries are cracking down on recycling contamination and quality. And because of that, we are having to train our drivers and our recycling coordinators to look out for businesses that are not sorting properly. So for example, this organics cart, you can see that's all pretty much trash. Our drivers have to tag the container and then they don't service it because that could contaminate the rest of their load if they're an organics driver. Same with recycling. We see a lot of businesses using the wrong bag. So if you have recycling in a black bag, like this blue cart here, we can't tell if that's actually garbage or recycling. So we have to assume it's garbage, and we can't service that as well. So that's something that is also just a little note I wanted to add. We are working on education with the businesses and tenants, training with all the staff there, but it's an ongoing process, and there's a lot to be done in that realm. So we often provide dumpster dimensions to developers when they're drawing out their enclosures to make sure that they build it big enough for all the material streams that they need. For dumpsters, the biggest dumpster size that we have that has wheels is a 4-yard, and so they have to keep that in mind when thinking about the total volume of material that they're generating, how many pickups are feasible, and then the amount of space. I don't think there are any places in Walnut Creek that could fit 6 or 8 yards because those don't have wheels, so it would need to be a pretty empty lot where our truck can just drive up directly, stick the forks in and then dump it that way. Usually the 4-yard or smaller is what we are dealing with because it has the wheels. We also provide measurements and truck turning radiuses, things like that, so that they can plan the truck approach correctly to make sure we have enough space to get to the dumpsters. One thing also is a lot of developers expect us to back up and out of properties, which is really dangerous for us, especially in downtown Walnut Creek, where we're backing up onto North Main or onto Locust, depending on the time of day as well. That's even more dangerous. So we really would prefer plans where we can drive in, access the bins, and then continue back out, going forward, not backing up. Some other things that we look at are overhead wires, branches, signage, or overhangs. Our trucks are pretty tall. Turning radius, as I mentioned, the truck length. These trucks are obviously very long. Also, businesses that have compactors or debris boxes, we need extra space for that. It's a special truck that delivers and removes those containers. Time restrictions are really important, especially in downtown Walnut Creek. Typically, our commercial drivers start their routes at around 3 or 3:30 a.m. And that's because we want to get through the commercial areas as early as possible before the streets get clogged up with commuters and everyone else, dropping kids off at school. And so we try to get to the busy areas very, very early in the morning. And then we also look at slope and traffic patterns as well. So one trend we've noticed in Walnut Creek and other places, but especially downtown, are the mixed-use buildings, infill. They are gorgeous buildings, but the tricky part for us is that because the upper floors are residential, we cannot service that building too early. The earliest we can go is 6 a.m. for residential areas, to any 200 feet within residential. So as I mentioned, we try to go through the downtown areas early, ideally, between 3:30 and 6, but now with the residential on top, that means we have to come after 6 a.m. And then that's when the streets are busier, there's commuters and so on. The other challenge is the enclosure rooms. They, again, usually think of trash last, and by then there's not much space left to put the dumpsters in, or it's very hidden in the middle of the building with weird access, gates, corridors, and that often leaves our trucks having to idle on the street while the driver goes in to find the bins, pull them out, and service them. Or in some situations, if the building has a day porter or property management services where someone will pull the bins out for us, that's really helpful. That saves time, but that is a cost for the property and potentially passed on to the residents. Some more, you guys have been very busy. The city has been very busy with these projects. And here's just one other example of a plaza in downtown Walnut Creek where the enclosure room is smack dab in the middle of the ground floor garage. And so this is probably the longest distance our driver has to walk all the way in while his truck is on Locust, get the bins. And this is a plaza where, because of different space issues, they have about 10 organics carts. So the driver can only carry 2, maybe 3 if he's talented, carts at a time to drag them out and back in. So again, this is just an issue that, a lot of times it's too late. The building's already built. It's been there for a long time, but we have to be creative with how we can service them safely. So regulations, we also deal with a lot of laws. There's mandatory recycling in Walnut Creek for any size business, whether you're a small business or a large business. You have to have recycling. You can satisfy that by having a cart or dumpsters. Mandatory organics is a little bit newer. Most of the restaurants in Walnut Creek are all set. They've got composting carts, but it is an issue for enclosures and for planning because we want to make sure that for the future, when more and more things have to be included in the organics recycling, we have a big enough dumpster space for that. So a lot of developers say, oh, yeah, we're fine. I have a little space carved out for a green cart. But that's not going to be enough in a couple years with some of the future organics regulations. SB 1383 is the big one coming up, and that's a huge, huge organics bill that requires everyone to compost, and not just food waste, but landscape waste, paper towels. They have some stuff about wood, textiles, and then there's an edible food recovery section as well. All of this requires space also. So it's a pretty big bill that we are working with cities to plan ahead for. As I mentioned, we do a lot of outreach with businesses. We have a team of recycling coordinators. We have actually 2 recycling coordinators dedicated to Walnut Creek that spend all their time out in the field meeting with businesses, schools, office buildings, everyone, to make sure they have what they need to comply with the law and that they have the training, the posters, the containers to do things properly. A couple restaurants. We focus on back of the house for restaurants because that's where it's easiest to train that restaurant staff. It's the same people. Whereas front of the house, if you've ever seen the bins in front of Starbucks or Chipotle, they may have different labels, but people are very confused in general, and everything's just mixed. So that's kind of the next phase, but first we're focusing on back of the house. And because of the organics laws, it's not just restaurants that have to participate. It is office buildings. This building, actually, you've probably seen the green bins, both in the bathrooms for paper towels, but also in the meeting rooms here, have to comply. Even small little businesses, retail. So that's going to be a big, big project coming up. And that's pretty much it for me. I don't know if we have time for questions, but I'll be here after as well.
Well, Kim, thank you. Hold on 1 second. We're going to, as I mentioned, we have this recorded, so if you do have a question, if you could just wait a moment, take the mic.
Hi, Terrell. I did a tour of the landfill in Pittsburgh, but I didn't see where they were separating the organic, and are they now separating them in a different area where they are pushing them down? Is that, or are they all going in the same place?
No, they're not going in the same place. So we have separate trucks that pick up each material. Even though all of our trucks are blue, that they're actually designated to different material streams. So the trucks that are picking up compost organics, they go to our transfer station in Martinez, and then we transfer those to even larger transfer trucks that go to our compost facility out in Manteca. And then recycling goes to the recycling sorting facility in Pittsburgh, separate from our landfill. Yeah.
So, other questions? Andy.
Thank you. Is this on? Interesting presentation. Question, you mentioned about the organics carts getting bigger over time. Do you think that the landfill dumpsters will downsize and hopefully at least partially offset the increase in green carts?
Yeah, that's definitely something we work with the businesses to do in order to make space for the green carts or for more recycling. We see if we can downsize the trash. Also, because of the way the rates are structured, everything is based on the size and frequency of the trash pickup. So businesses could actually save a little bit of money initially by downsizing trash and putting more into recycling and organics. We just have to be careful that they're putting the right stuff into the blue and green and that they're not just trying to save money and hide their contamination.
I'm sorry. One last question, because I went to the landfill, so.
Yeah.
It was amazing to me to see how the landfill was creating energy, but the oil, how was that being treated? Because that didn't look like it was properly contained and so forth. So how is that actually being treated?
Yeah, the 5-gallon buckets of oil, that is not a best practice. Actually, they probably would have gotten a citation from Central Sand or other agencies that do the inspections. They should be working with an authorized oil recycler who will usually provide them with an enclosed container or a bin. They then schedule pickups and take that away and recycle it. Okay. Yeah.
The energy portion was just amazing. I was just like, wow.
Do you know if the turning radius for the trucks is about the same as a fire truck? Like for new home developments, if they have to access the street and things?
I believe our trucks are a little bit shorter. That's an interesting point, though, comparing it to the fire trucks. With some of the new housing developments we're working with in other cities, they'll show us roads and say, like, hey, this was approved by the fire department, so it should be fine with you guys, right? But we still want to be involved very early on, because what they don't realize is the fire trucks are only going there hopefully once a year or less, just for emergencies. We're going there every week, and we're not just sending one truck, it's usually 3 trucks for garbage, recycle, and organics. And so our trucks need to have a turnaround if it's like a little cul-de-sac or a street, to be able to turn back instead of backing up all the way out. But I believe we are shorter than fire trucks.
Kimberly, I had a quick question. So you talk about, you've just mentioned a couple of times different agencies. You mentioned Central Sand, we just mentioned fire. Of course, you're here at the City of Walnut Creek, which is a partner in all this. Can you speak to the level of engagement among and between outside agencies? Again, City of Walnut Creek is not a full-service city, right? We don't have our own trash, we don't have our own electricity generation, et cetera. How is it that Republic Services works with outside agents? Could you explain a little bit about that to give us some insight?
Yeah, it varies city by city. So that's something we're actually trying to work on, is getting involved really from the beginning of especially for development projects, where we still have the opportunity to make some suggestions and have the developer tweak some plans, whether it's something minor like wider doors on the enclosure, or whether it's major like, hey, you need to double the size of your enclosure. So depending on the city, we are involved in different levels, and for most cities, we're on the list of referrals where the project needs our approval before they can get their final permits or approvals or inspections.
Other questions in the room? I have a couple of others, but I don't want to dominate here. But it's amazing. This is not something you think about until you start talking about it, and then you realize how pretty much ubiquitous trash is.
Yeah.
And you don't, I guess, think about it. You probably hear that. I mean, I'm coming up with a whole bunch of questions, but I want to ask if any of my colleagues or others have any questions. Yeah.
Most people only think about the trash component. Can you talk about the energy component, and in terms of how trash is actually being used as energy, because you guys are actually doing that a lot?
Yeah, that's more at the landfill site. So a lot of our landfills have energy capture, where we capture some of the methane that is coming out from the garbage that's under. We are, though, trying to promote recycling and composting as a higher use of material. Although the energy is great, with recycling, the material can then be turned into new materials, which reduces the overall footprint. With composting, we're able to create that really good soil that we can use for farmers, for landscaping, to give that back to the environment. And then beyond the feel-good reasons for that, it's also mandatory, so we have to push that as well.
Good morning. You mentioned about the fact that trash, solid disposal is not thought well at the beginning of the project. What is your plan review protocol? Who has to submit the plans to you at what phase? The architect, the city forward? Is there like a approval process, like a Contra Costa? The sanitary district has a stamp of approval for plans. I haven't seen one from Republic.
Yeah, it depends city by city. We typically would receive the plans if the project or the city remembers to send it to us, which is a challenge. But we receive the plans and then we review it with our operations manager, and they also discuss it with the drivers that service that area, because they know the routes the best and they know the challenges in those specific neighborhoods or downtown corridors. We respond back with comments or suggestions or requests. Sometimes it's a back and forth process over 10 times, changes, compromises, that sort of thing. And then eventually, when we believe we can safely and efficiently service a setup, then we would approve it and then let the project know.
So you said to send some of the plans to Republic. Is there a main contact that we could have so that when we do have development plans that we can send over to them to look and approve?
Yeah, that would be me. I have my cards in the back, and I can work with Ethan on setting up the protocol. We, up until now, we received some plans. We don't know if we are receiving all of them. Sometimes we know about a new building after it's built, and they call us to set up garbage service. So we definitely want to improve that relationship with all of our cities to improve the whole process.
Just as a quick follow-up to that, conclusion of today's forum and moving forward, everyone here will get an email with links to both Kim's presentation, the survey I mentioned at the top, et cetera. So you'll have her contact information as shown on the slide. So that will be there, but also we can reach out, or feel free to reach out if you wish. Other questions for Kim and her presentation? I had one other one. So because you mentioned it, and I did want to touch on it, it's one of the trends you've seen is the mixed use development. There's a lot of infill. We're running out of, if we ever had a lot to begin with, but there's not a lot of green space just for green open field development. We're finding a lot of infill projects, mixed use. You mentioned a restriction, 6 a.m. You can't, is that by law that you can't, by policy? You said you can't go in and service it before 6 a.m. because of residences. Can you, I'm just curious.
Yeah, the 6 a.m. rule is in our contract with the Central Contra Costa Solid Waste Authority. So the contract spells out specifically, you know, you can go service commercial, you know, between, I think it's 3 or 4 a.m. until pretty late in the evening. For residential, or within 200 feet of residential, it's 6 a.m. to 6 p.m.
So you went right to where I was going to go next, which is if it can't happen early in the morning, can it happen late at night? And I don't mean late at like midnight, because that's early in the morning to some. But can it happen something at like 10 o'clock, or is that something I guess I'm looking at the nature of trash service or management, right? Is it an early morning or a late night type? Because people are awake at, say, 9 o'clock at night or something. And if that's, I don't know, I'm just curious if that's something you've thought through or talked about.
You know, the late night hasn't come up. Right now, we're restricted to 6 p.m. But, you know, that might be something that the Solid Waste Authority looks into the more we have the denser, you know, infill projects.
So Solid Waste Authority gives you a 12-hour window to service residential?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
Didn't know that.
Yeah.
See, there's so many questions. Anyway, I'm sorry. Kathleen?
Yeah, following up on that, I know there was a project that we talked about it and it getting like the first pickup, and I don't know if it was 6 a.m. or maybe 5 a.m. And at that time, it didn't have residential, but it will soon have residential right across the street, so I don't know how. So I don't know how that impacts that, because that was, how that project was approved with that understanding that it would have like a very early morning pickup.
Yeah, it often is case by case, depending on the project, how big it is, you know, where it's located. We do try strategically to service certain places by certain times. So, for example, schools, we cannot go during drop-off or pickup times, of course. So that really limits us. The schools are often in neighborhoods, though, so the drivers have to leave the more dense part of their route to go to the school at a certain time, get out of there by a certain time. And so it does start to get tricky when we have all of these accounts that have very specific time requests. We try to accommodate them, but one of the limits is the number of routes, drivers, and trucks that we have.
I had one other, again, full of questions this morning. So my question is, in terms of California has a lot of laws and active legislature, you mentioned a number of bills that you're trying, 1383 being the big one, I think you're focusing on, because it reduces, presumably, streams or restructures those streams. What do you see as, broadly, if you can speak to this, kind of the nature of trash collection, waste management, as you start to see kind of the segregation of these streams? It's not all just one dump, one big trash pile, right? I mean, we're starting to sort that. Can you speak to that a bit, like where you see this headed, if you have a crystal ball, where you think this may be headed in terms of what you do for a living, what Public Services does?
Yeah, I think things are getting more complicated. So, you know, where we started with 2 or 3 streams, soon it will be 4 because of the edible food component for SB 1383. Then you might have another bin for textiles because that will, you know, be regulated, and then wood might be separate. And then the other challenge is, in addition to these different regulations, is the changing markets for recycling. So depending on the international markets really for the recyclable materials. That also kind of dictates how we educate businesses, how we set up programs, and what kinds of levels of quality and contamination we can allow. All of that affects what on-the-ground businesses are able to do with sorting their materials.
Okay. Yep. Yeah, let's keep it coming. Thank you, Heather.
Just want to add to that, I think it's going to also change the way that you pay for service, because we have a contract right now with Republic, but that's going to end, I think, in a year or two, and we'll be renegotiating. And I think what's going to change is that there are going to be charges now for recycling, because there just isn't a market for it. So that's going to now, potentially, who knows, but that could easily go on the bills.
Yeah, so our contract is up in 2025, but every year we work with the agencies to evaluate the rates, make sure that everything is fair. And one item is that up until now we've been promoting recycling and organics as basically free. Add more recycling, it's free, it's fine. We'll add another blue dumpster, another pickup, it's all included. But the truth is there is a cost associated with recycling and with organics, because we still have to send a driver and a truck out. We still have to transport that material to the transfer station, the compost facility, the sorting facility, and there are costs associated with that. So that is a trend that a lot of agencies are moving towards, is potentially having a cost spelled out for each service.
So 2 questions. You said that, the recycling market is drying up, meaning that China's not taking a lot of them anymore. But even if you increase the cost, does that go to us recycling it then? You recycling it? Where's it going to go?
I know. Well, right now they're stockpiling a lot of it, they're trying to get rid of it.
Okay, so
So right now, the garbage rates are kind of subsidizing the recycling and composting. And so you just see that one price listed as garbage, but recycling and composting is included. And so when we see people downsize their garbage a lot, but then add in the recycling and composting, there's a little bit of an imbalance there.
So you said you still have to send a driver out to pick it up. Don't they pick it up all at once? I guess they not, because it's a different truck. Yeah, yeah. We just put it out all at the same time.
Yes. Yep. 3 different drivers, 3 different trucks.
I guess I would say to that, so you've got that as another stream evolves, a 4th stream. Is that a 4th truck and a 4th set of drivers? And
So if you're talking about the edible food component of SB 1383, we likely will not be handling that. We would be working with other nonprofits like White Pony Express or different other organizations that are better suited to handle the edible food and get it to the organizations that need the food. But in terms of space at the businesses, that's still operationally something they have to plan for. How are they going to separate and save the edible food, keep it safe, and get that to where it needs to go.
You mentioned how there's 3 trucks that go to every property every time. I know Concord Disposal, they've started using I don't know what they call them, but basically trucks that have 2 tanks, whatever, where and so you just have like 1 truck or maybe 2 trucks. I think 1 truck is like garbage and recycle, and then the other one's the yard waste. Has Republic looked into doing something like this in Walnut Creek to cut down on emissions?
Yeah, we have those in some other places, but one of the downsides is that then the truck needs to go, it gets filled up much quicker because of the volume reduction. And so then the truck needs to drive all the way to the transfer station multiple times during the day to empty the truck and then to go drive all the way back out to the neighborhoods to complete the route. So although it would be less trucks, it would be more long trips as well, having to empty more often at the transfer station.
Okay. We're getting close to the top of the hour, and we're always trying to be mindful of everyone's time. But again, questions seem to be percolating. I don't know if there are any other last 2 questions, if there are any. Going once and going twice. All right. Kimberly, thank you so much for being here this morning. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And as I mentioned, again, thank you. As I mentioned at the top, this presentation will be made available. We'll email that out. And I'd also like to encourage those of you to, number one, come back and visit us in February. Number two, visit our survey link. Give us your feedback. We're eager and interested in it. We want to keep this forum relevant. And I think this is a perfect example today of something you may not think about, but I think has real implications for both a city, outside organizations, private developers, et cetera. And then lastly, I'll say all the materials you'll see here, we always wrap up and include in that email. So there will be a couple of things, the YouTube link if you wish to re-watch something or catch something, or maybe you thought you heard something you didn't or whatever. Secondly, the survey. Third, the materials. And with that, we'll close for December 2019 and look ahead to the new year. Happy holidays to all of you. Thanks for being here.